Hey, Dan, how are you, man?
Good, good. How are you doing?
Very good. Hey, welcome to the show. Glad to have you here, and we really appreciate making the time for us.
For sure, for sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Hey, Dan, I was wondering if maybe you could just give us a brief overview of your work history and your educational background. I know it can't be brief because there's like Harvard and a bunch of other, there's a lot in there. If you could maybe just give us an overview of your background.
I'll try to give the short version, and I'll touch on the parts that I think are most important to me, that are meaningful to me, I guess is a good way to say it. So I grew up in a manufacturing household. My dad was in manufacturing. His dad was in manufacturing. So that was my experience with companies and entrepreneurship and all that sort of stuff. I started working with his CFO when I was 14 years old, just sitting next to him and like learning how, like what accounting is basically. And then like kind of started there. I was also at that time, probably, this was the early 90s, was the guy who knew the most about computers because no one in that place knew anything about computers. So I somehow became the de facto computer advisor guy. I went to college at 15. I went there initially to study theater, but then switched to philosophy because I liked it so much. And then later on continued, as you noted, with math and physics degrees, a whole bunch of like business stuff and finance and all that sort of stuff over this whole time. I'm a lifelong learner type person. So I've got a whole 20-year plan still ahead of me. Wow. As far as academics and stuff goes. So I'm super excited about that. Anyway, I went to college. While I was in college, I started a small tech startup, which was basically selling traffic to Wall Street firms. Now we're kind of getting into like the mid to late 90s. And I sold traffic to them until one of them bought me when I was 19 years old. And I sold that and had a nice little bit of an exit. Nothing life-changing, but enough to be able to say, okay, now what do I do? And then I focused my attention from that point on basically acquisitions with a focus on automation and process optimization to increase cash flow, which of course increases value. And I learned about consolidations and acquisitions and stuff back in my dad's business when he was acquiring companies and consolidating them into his manufacturing company. So did that until 2013. Once I sold kind of everything and decided, hey, before I go on to the next step of my journey, let me move to Florida. So I moved from Chicago, where I born and raised, moved down here to Florida, Palm Beach County. And I've been here ever since. And I've really expanded my reach since moving down here, because my focus when I was acquiring companies with the automation and optimization and kind of fix and flip scenario, I really I was the CEO. I acquired the company, put myself in charge, and then I made it all happen, right? And so that worked, and I made money with that, but it didn't really, two problems with it. One, it wasn't scalable because it was completely dependent on me, putting myself into these different positions, and you only have so much time. And second, I wanted to, I was doing 20% of what I liked and 80% of what I didn't like. I was like, how am I going to do 100% of what I like and what I'm, highest and best use and where I can really drive the most value and kind of like get rid of the rest of it. And frankly, it really took, what was that, 2013? So we're talking about, 8 years. It's really taken like a good 5-6 of those years, first time here in Florida, when I was here in Florida, to kind of figure out how to do it. And I'm happy to report over the last couple of years, I think I very clearly figured out how to do it. So I've merged the two things. So anyway, sorry, that's the high level overview.
One thing that I really like about that story is sitting down with the CFO at 15 years old and being able to glean that knowledge from him. And I'm sure having that experience and being able to work with your dad's company and work with someone with that knowledge at such a young age put thoughts and ideas into your head that you wouldn't normally have as a normal 15-year-old, that you wouldn't normally have as someone who's, going out mowing lawns as a kid, just trying to make a few extra bucks. You're thinking of business acquisitions and actual legit stuff as a young kid. And it shows by your first exit at 19, which is crazy. So I just think that's really neat that
super. Definitely was a great experience. And for all the reasons that you said, I would mention to anybody that the key there is being willing to listen. Because there was a phase in my career after the exit and pretty much before moving to Florida, kind of that whole stage of the early 2000s, where my mindset was very closed. Like I kind of had it figured out, quote unquote, figured out. And I wasn't as open as I was back when I was 15, right? And so the irony of that is that in my non-openness, I was not, I stopped learning, sort of. Like I learned, but I was solving it all myself all the time, which, because I thought that I was smart and I thought that I can do anything kind of thing, as many entrepreneurs think they are and can, and they can, don't get me wrong. But I found kind of in, the last bit of my life, the last couple of years, that the more you can learn from others, and the more you can listen to others, and learn from their experience, so you don't have to go through those trials and tribulations, is kind of like key to success, and key to like. And when I say success, I don't mean just financial success. I mean like kind of internal, kind of happiness and being in the right place for who you are as a person, because that's not generic. Like financial success is generic. We all get the same dollars at the end of the day. But I've known lots of people who've made tons of money and are miserable. And I've known other people who've just kind of had moderate financial success, but are fantastically happy and loving life. So if I had to choose who I wanted to be, I would definitely choose the loving life guy, because that's really what it's all about. We all get to the same place in the end anyway. So if you're not having fun with it at the same time, then why bother?
Yeah, very true.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think it actually leads into a little bit, we kind of, poked at it in the introduction, the idea of not being replaced by a robot. And I think in around 2015, you did a TEDx talk around, by that name, how not to be replaced by robots. And the reason for that talk was that you had by then become sort of an expert in automation and using technology as a way to scale and grow businesses and sort of reduce the number of humans in the process. And, so I think a lot of people might, the gut reaction might be like, ooh, that's kind of yucky. Why are we trying to replace all the people? But, the way your talk is, and spoiler alert, I don't want to kill it for everybody, but so much of not being replaced by a robot is putting more and more emphasis on the things that make you human. And I believe that is sort of what you're alluding to here, and I almost wonder if some of that is just kind of a natural evolution. As we get older, we stumble upon that truth. And so I wonder, I say all that to preface a discussion on automation. And if we can maybe go back and talk a little bit about your trajectory or your pathway through sort of purchase, acquisition, consolidation, and sale, because that whole route was done in this really automated way. I think a lot of people think of business acquisition as, okay, well, now I'm moving into a company, I got to do all the work. But your approach was really, how do I reduce this down to, sort of the least amount of human involvement possible? So I wonder if you talk a little bit about that, and then just sort of, how that relates to what you've learned over the years.
Yeah, great question. So the first thing that jumps to mind in regards to the do the work that's more human, as my TED Talk alludes to or says. Think about it. If you can, like, especially now, especially 2015, and even still today, if I can build a relatively inexpensive piece of software to replace the work that you do, odds are you're probably not super fulfilled from doing that work. Because a computer isn't very smart or creative or imaginative or emotional or all these things that humans are, and that we, in some form, one of those things that I just mentioned, you probably get some positive feelings about, and that you want to do more of that thing. The computer doesn't do any of those things. So if I can replace you with software that does that, you need to find something else to do. And you know what I mean? Like, it's better for you anyway in the long run. It may, in the short term, it's not great, but in the long term, I think it produces a lot of opportunity for us as a species to make better use of our, true talents. So that was kind of the first part of that. Second part, the acquisition part of it. Yeah. So my strategy was strictly around the idea that, So if you're going to do a regular acquisition, like a merger acquisition consolidation type thing, kind of like what my dad was doing, right? You have two companies, they have a bunch of redundant overhead and a bunch of redundant things. And so when you put them together, you can take your kind of profit per job or profit per unit or profit per customer, whatever you want to say, which was your, contribution margin to your overhead, and just lump that into your existing overhead and make a whole bunch of money, because now you can cut one of the overheads basically, right? Pretty straightforward consolidation sort of stuff. So my model was the kind of doing the same thing, but we were cutting it out of we were basically capturing the dollars that were trapped in the inefficiency of human beings in the process, right? So like, if I can increase efficiency by 50%, whatever that dollar amount was kind of found money that was in there the whole time that the company was paying out in order to continue to run inefficiently. So that was essentially the model. And what I was able to do in most cases, 8 acquisitions, 6 were profitable. One of them was kind of break even, and then one of them was a stinker. So the odds were pretty, we did pretty good as far as, success goes. And what was really successful about it, or what really worked about it, was that in most cases, I was able to conceptualize what we were going to do during the diligence process. So even before we closed, so maybe we made a deal, like we kind of said, okay, here's the deal. You want this much money, or whatever the deal is, and great, we agree to that. Let's go into diligence. And then you go into your standard diligence process, which is, verifying the numbers, verifying the customers, verifying the employees, the processes, the systems. They kind of let you look under the hood, right? So we didn't tell anyone this, but while we were looking under the hood, we were also simultaneously designing the new workflows and new processes within the company where we identified the most potential inefficiency. Like that's really what we were most interested in, So while the kind of accountants and lawyers and all that were doing their kind of standard stuff, kind of our systems people, myself and the others, we're looking more at the processes side of things. So what we'd actually be able to do in some cases is, in one case in particular, which was the most kind of extreme example of this, we were able to design the system, build it, and it was a risk because if for some reason the deal didn't close, we would have built something for nothing, but build it all before we closed. So then once we closed on the deal, we actually did not take any of the people into the new company that we were going to lay off because of the process stuff. So like, no, there wasn't even like a transition because it was so simple. It was such a straightforward example that we saw that previous owners didn't know. And so we were able to make all of the adjustments to everything at like closing basically, which was pretty cool process and everything. So that was really the strategy was to be able to look ahead, build the systems, get them implemented as quickly as possible. And then once they were up and running, kind of fix and flip, try to find the next person to sell it to that they wanted them to take advantage of that new efficiency and new profit.
Well, and one thing I think is particularly interesting about your trajectory is that the types of businesses you were choosing weren't necessarily, I think, what might come to mind for most people. So for example, if I'm running a small business and I was thinking about how I might use implementation, maybe what comes to, or automation, excuse me, what comes to mind is, hiring or buying a robot to flip hamburgers, or, a new piece of software or something to do some sort of job for me. But what I'm not thinking of, and the one that I think that intrigued me the most, was your live performance venues.
Yes.
Because I think that those are things that people wouldn't traditionally sort of associate with automation. Now, what you automated might be processes and I don't know, you can elaborate, but I mean, the basics, the software issues, but you were actually able to get it down to a very few, least number of people necessary to actually be full-time employees. So I think that might be an interesting caveat or an interesting addition to this story for our listeners who might not be sure how automation fits in their company.
That's a great point. It doesn't, everything, the highest opportunity for technology and automation is where technology and automation doesn't already exist. So like looking for those kind of oddball places that you can apply it is really where you see your most value. Not to mention that, like, it's worth mentioning that, like, I'm glad you brought up the theater example, because the theater was a combination of technology and business model that made that so successful, and for as long as it was successful. Because you have to look at the business model at the same time in this particular case, and many times, that's a lot of what I do now is there's a lot of focus on business model stuff. Let's just use that as an example because everyone can understand it. So live theater venue, what are the two busiest nights of live theaters? Friday and Saturday, right? And then maybe you got Thursday, and maybe you got something on Sunday afternoon. That's kind of the meat of it. Unless you're, I don't know, Cats or Wicked on Broadway, where you're running, 20 shows a night for all week and packing them in. Traditionally, regular theaters, especially small venues, live venues, clubs, all these categories fall into that. We have to make all our money Friday and Saturday night. And in a theater's place, a lot of times what they would do is they would set up, you set up like an 8-week run or a 12-week run of one show. You build out the set, you put all the lights up just for that show, and then you run your show Friday, Saturday, 8 o'clock, and then you lock the doors and you come back 5 days later, and then you do it all over. And then everyone's confused on why they don't make any money, and like why they're going broke, and like why they're always in this turmoil. So our theaters, we owned 3 at one point, live venues. We basically profited. Let me get the numbers right. We had, 12 to 15 times the revenue of our next closest competitor, wow. And our profit was like 3 or 4 times their gross revenue all year. And how we did that is we just focused on the idea of asset utilization. This is another advantage for people who are interested in this sort of like, where are the opportunities? Finding industries or weird kind of niches where people who are operating in them are not business people, like they didn't get it to be in business. Those are good opportunities because this is basic stuff. If I have an asset and it's not making me money, it's costing me money. So I need to keep it busy, right? Like super easy. And then a willingness to build a business model and stick to it that might be against the trend in the industry. So like in the theater business, it took us a while. It didn't take us a while. That's not the right way to say it because it happened quickly. It took a real commitment because people were pressuring us to stop doing it that way because it didn't fit the traditional approach. So we basically told people, we don't care what night of the week your show is, you're not going to set up a set, because if you put one set on the stage, now you can't put any other shows on the stage. It's got to be rotating. So you can set up as crazy of a setup as you want, but you got to be able to take it down in 30 minutes because I got to put another show on stage. So like our Saturday night, which other theaters were running one show, we were starting at like 10:30 in the morning and then running different shows with different sets, with different casts, with different show, the whole thing from 10:30 in the morning to the last one started at like midnight. So like whatever that is, 7 or 8 shows, 9 shows in that day. And then we were running shows on Tuesday at 10:30, like we had everything going. So that was the business model. And then on the automation side of it, which was key, was we built a whole custom software package for ticketing. Mainly, I guess ticketing is really the main thing because we had to facilitate the turnover of people in the venue. We couldn't have this kind of like piece together system where people are like swiping credit cards and then they're like buying online through one system which doesn't talk to your internal system, and then you've got like box office people handing out paper tickets. Like we got rid of all of that. Like basically everything worked online, and we started building that system back in 2003. So like this was like really ahead of it. And then that same system in its original form, of course updated along the way, carried the business from 2003 till 2018. So like wow. It was good software that we built, and a bunch of different venues, different locations, even some remote locations when we did went into venues that we didn't own. What was I saying about that? Yeah. So anyway, so that was the point is that the software portion of it was all about limiting friction in people in the mix, because the more people there were, the slower it made the process of getting people in and out of the venue. So
I really like that story because I've worked in the live music and music venue industry for quite a while. There's a venue in Tacoma, Washington called Jazz Bones, where I would actually perform from 10 o'clock till 2. But before that, they had a band, they had a comedian, they had,
exactly.
But they would stack the day up where they would have different stuff going on all the time, and did exactly what you said, was just be able to get one crowd, an early dinner crowd for a comedian, and then get a completely rotation starting at 10 o'clock where that crowd leaves and it's a completely different thing. It's a nightclub for the night, and I loved that kind of business model because they had so many more people coming through the door versus just, hey, we're a nightclub and we just do a DJ, so I relate with that. And then also the ticketing process.
Gives you from a marketing perspective.
Yeah. Well, and with your integrated system with the ticketing, that right there changes the whole dynamics of the equation. So I really like that story. Did you go into theater knowing anything about it, or did you just that was an opportunity, let's see how this goes, or did you pursue that as your first venture?
Yeah, great question. So the way that I got into that was while I was in college, I joined an improv team, like so many people in Chicago, like so many people in Chicago do. And then when I sold my internet company, I was just kind of like, okay, well, I'm going to go back and do math and physics at University of New Mexico. And then while I was at University of New Mexico, there was really no improv place in Albuquerque, New Mexico, of all places. So I was like, I'm going to start an improv theater, like just because. And then they were doing this downtown revitalization thing. And so instead of just starting a group, I was like, I'm going to buy a building and I'm going to redevelop it. And so I did. I bought a building right in their main downtown area. I built a 200-seat theater on the first floor, 100-seat theater on the second floor, rehearsal space, office space on the second floor as well, and started a theater. And then kind of figured out the business model while I was in New Mexico. And then was like, hey, this actually works. I should bring it back to Chicago where there really is a big community of producers and artists. And then that's what I did. And then the Chicago location opened, and then we bought a third location a couple of years later in a suburb near there.
That's great. Yeah, it's always interesting to hear how people got into a certain field, when they're not really in theater or whatever, but they ended up in it, or they end up buying a restaurant and they're doing this. And the backstory is always fun to hear.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, and I think it's interesting too to hear, especially as it pertained to these venues, but really as it pertained to all the businesses you're running, in that automation isn't necessarily the enemy, right? I mean, you're a little tongue in cheek with the idea of don't be replaced by a robot, but the concept really is that the automation is really just another tool, right? This is another thing we can deploy to do a better job, or be more efficient or whatever. And so you really illustrate that in the story of this venue, how the automation wasn't, robots to adjust your lights for you. It was just the business model and the processes that allowed you to turn around tickets quickly, or to make sure that all the systems were communicating with one another. So I think it's really useful to hear these different types of automation, because I think automation has become one of those buzzy words that people just say to mean, email marketing or something, but it really doesn't mean anything. And so I think automation is one of these sort of misunderstood things. But I think also there is, this fear of change and that sort of thing. And I think there is, even if we're joking about being replaced entirely, I mean, ultimately there is a change taking place. Technology is facilitating a change. And there's another story you mentioned where you were talking about having done this automation process for, I believe it was some sort of like legal video company or something like that. Yeah. And what I thought was interesting about that one in particular is, first of all, the idea that because you still needed to have people making videos, right? So, I mean, there's automated processes, yet those automated processes are interacting with, real live humans that have to do some jobs. And then also I liked what I thought was particularly interesting, and this might be an opportunity for other entrepreneurs or people who are interested in automation as a service, identifying situations like this where people are doing things in an old-fashioned way. Now granted, this has been a lot of years, but I happen to know that there are a few industries out there that still do things in sort of antiquated ways. I do a lot of work in and around like real estate titles and escrow and things like that. Super old school, right?
Yeah.
And so to talk about automation is a way to bring those things not only into the future, but make them much more efficient. And I think you mentioned earlier the idea of finding money. You know, there's found money in there because you've been doing these things anyway, just now you can do them in half the time. So I wonder if you just sort of maybe we could talk about that story in particular, just sort of how automation worked in that particular instance.
Yeah, so that particular instance is a good example of, so basically how that business shook out was you still had to have the guys in the field, right? Because you couldn't send robots out with cameras and all that sort of stuff. So you had to have those guys in the field. But the opportunity there is that it was all paperwork, like especially because it's legal too. You have to be very precise to make sure you get all the numbers and letters and everything right and all the documents that were associated with it. And you also had to, there was also a lot of changes. I don't know if anybody who's worked in the legal business, trials and lawyers and all that, they're always changing the schedule for whatever reason. They're changing the schedule. So the problem with that business was, us going into it, was that there was just so much change, schedule change. Oh, great. Now we got to update this 20 different ways, or there's something over here that happened that was not what we expected. Now we got to go back to all of our paperwork and our manual systems and our calendar that we update manually and all these things. Like, it was an accident waiting to happen. Basically, there was like the potential for human error. Like, that alone was a reason to fix it. So really with that one, it really was an automated portal that the video guys out in the field could access that gave instant updates and to both the schedule and to whatever was going on with the particular case back to the home office, so that way at the time when the tapes came back to the office and the video editing guys got it, they knew exactly what they had to do. There was no lag in communication. Everything was all ready to go. And that was kind of the end of the process. At the beginning of the process, during the scheduling phase, when you have to send out all of your your notices, and you have to update all the stuff as it relates to getting everyone on the same page, that was completely automated. That was just, everybody has their own logins, everybody can see the calendar, and they're looking at the same thing. I had a friend once in the automation kind of world who used to always say one version of the truth. There's one version of the truth, one database that if it says that date, that's the date that everybody sees. Like, there isn't 20 different versions of it. Because the problem is what these people were doing was, because they were doing everything manually, they were creating PDFs of whatever it is that they had to send out. So they would create a PDF, send it out to 5 different people, different lawyers, whatever. Something would get changed. They'd have to make a new PDF with the slight change, and then send it out again. So now you've got 2 different PDFs that are basically the same, except for this one minor change, sent out to 5 or 6 people. Now multiply that over a couple month period and multiple changes, and it's just like a mess. So that was kind of the focus on that one in terms of making it work. But the thing I wanted to point out was that entrepreneurs in general should be aware of is that when they think of their hourly rate, there's a book by Rob Slee, his name is, and it's called Time Really Is Money. And it's essentially the idea that entrepreneurs need to think of, they've got to be aware of where they spend their time. And then I've kind of extrapolated from that too. They have to be aware of where their employees spend their time. Because if you're paying somebody $20 an hour and you've got them in some sort of workflow process that has them doing a job that's really a $10 an hour job, you're overpaying by $10, right? And it's the same thing if you're the entrepreneur. If you are kind of wearing a lot of hats because you're just starting out or whatever, that's fine. But you've got to be aware when you're doing a $10 an hour job or a $100 an hour job or a $10,000 an hour job, right? I want to focus as much of my time on those $10,000 an hour things. And I'm literally talking $10,000 an hour. I'm not exaggerating, because there's other people who work for $1 million an hour, right? That's the point. The whole point of Rob Slee's book is that you have to work your way up that hourly rate, ladder. But in the way that you do that is run by run. You can't jump ahead. Like if you're at a $20 an hour type situation, you're not going to jump to $1,000 an hour tomorrow. What you're going to do is you're going to be at $20. You're going to bring someone in behind you who's going to take your $20 hour slot so you can jump yourself up to $50. And then you're going to do that for a while. And then you're going to let go of your $50 one, let someone else do that. And you're going to jump up to $150. And you just kind of keep working your way up. And then your viewpoint and your perspective gets higher and higher. And perhaps your time frame gets longer and longer in terms of what you're looking at. You're not so focused on the day-to-day, but you're looking further out in time, making like longer term decisions. And that's how you get yourself up, kind of how you grow your business. And you have to do that if you're the COO or you're playing the COO for your company as the entrepreneur founder, you have to kind of have that same thought process for all of your employees and all of your workflow processes within your business. Because again, if you're paying $20 an hour and it's something that I can write a piece of code for $500, I'd rather just write a piece of code and then eliminate it completely. Now it doesn't cost me $20 an hour anymore, right? But I have to be aware of that as a possibility. So
can you talk about that process of like an acquisition? You're going in, you're buying it. I read on your Medium article that acquisitions always take longer than expected, but
Sure.
Those processes that you're defining and trying to figure out, how do you approach a company and come in and figure out this $20 an hour job can be replaced with the $500 piece of code or this or that? I'm sure there's, you have your own systems and your own way of thinking of it, but in the actual due diligence process, how has that worked for you in the past as far as defining those breaking points and then fixing them and moving forward?
Yeah,
I guess it's all dependent based on sorry. I was going to say, I bet it's all dependent based on what job you're coming into or what company you're taking over, because different systems and processes apply in different situations. So really it's a matter of just being able to step back and look at a broad overview, right? And just kind of be able to see.
Yes. It's two things. It's you have to have a high enough view, like you're saying. Let's call it three things actually. You have to have a high enough view that you can see all the pieces working together in order to determine, like if you're inside the company and you can't see that, or your mindset just won't allow it, you can't see it. Okay, cool. So first you have to be able to see it. Two, you have to be able to have the control to make it happen. So this is the issue that, like, say, blockchain as a technology has. When people start talking about, we can use blockchain to, like create accountability in the shipping industry. Perfect. So you got a high level view and you have like a concept of how it's going to work. You've identified the issue, which is, like, to your point, like, okay, we've identified the $500 piece of code. Now I can control the whole shipping industry using blockchain. My second maxim, though, is not fulfilled, because how do you execute that, right? I can't simultaneously in one shot get all of the shipping people across the whole world to utilize my new blockchain solution. So there has to be like an entry point where, whether it's a macro level thing like blockchain in the shipping industry, or whether it's acquiring a company and we're only working on a particular part of the process, we have to have an entry point at which we can make it happen. We have the authority to make it happen, and we can do that in a practical way. It's the same issue with anything where there's a big macro level change, whether it's world or on a company scale. You have to be able to take the intermediate steps to be able to manage the change. I think one of you said earlier about how it's all about change, and change can be scary, or something about change. It's change management. It's being able to, it's as much a process of managing the change within the organization as it is conceptualizing the process and the systems and then implementing them. You have to have a change management plan as well. And depending on how complex the system is and how many different people it's going to affect, or worse, customers that it might affect, because now you're playing with revenue a little bit. You you got to have that all figured out in advance. And sometimes that's easy, sometimes that's hard, but a lot of it is just being aware that's a possibility.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's a big part of it.
In that same article. Yeah. In that same article, you talked about getting rid of the middle managers. So I'm sure there's a lot of issues in that when you acquire something that they're doing these processes their way and actually pulling them out of the equation, it probably opens that whole door to be able to do what you want to come in and implement without having the backlash. Right. So, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So in these sort of last 20 minutes or so, I wondered if we could start pivoting into a little bit of discussion about 81C. What I think is interesting, or sort of what really got me thinking about it, and actually I think it segues nicely off of what we've been talking about so far, is you mentioned in there early on that you were doing a lot of work that you didn't love. You were doing, maybe 20% of things you like, 80% of things you didn't. And, at some point you were maybe a little more able to, I guess, find your path or choose a passion and then sort of pursue it. Is that sort of where 81C comes in?
No, actually 81C is more of a technical machine. The find your path part of it is kind of what I've been doing the last 2 years. So 81C was basically our opportunity to create a public company with the SEC, like totally legal, with the SEC that utilized blockchain technology for tokenization of equity, right? Like that was kind of like, that's what that is. And that machine, is what we built with that. And so, there's some financing opportunities with that. That's kind of like what that was from 2018, I guess is when that was. And in the late 2019 is when I kind of found my approach that has allowed me to really scale my kind of investing and advising opportunities, because it really comes down to investing at the end of the day. But what I determined is that I wanted to approach that. The thing that I was annoyed with in my conversation was every time I'd start do some sort of business thing is I always had to do sales. I don't think I wrote anything. I have something written that I haven't published yet that's kind of about this, but I'm not a sales guy by any means. I'm very much a connection relationship person. Like I love to talk to people. I love learning about people. I love hearing about what they're passionate about and then figuring out how our two, passions for this and passion for that can kind of somehow move together in a forward direction. Like I love all that stuff, but I don't like just like generic sales of like, make the calls, send the emails, do all these things that a lot of times you end up doing in startup situations, especially. And then of course you do them forever and as you go along. So I just wanted to be more of an investor type person who didn't have to do that. Didn't have to do those. I didn't want to do those things directly. I don't mind advising on those things, but it wasn't my thing that I did that enough. Kind of looked at it like I paid my dues maybe. So I said, well, I'm going to take a different approach than I have before. Is I'm going to just start talking to people. And I started doing what I call a walk and talk. And then out of the walk and talk, I kind of created this wandering Kung Fu master approach to entrepreneurship from my perspective. And what I said was, I'm just going to, if I'm interested in like talking with somebody, like we met at a party or we met out on the street or whatever, and I want to continue the conversation, I'll just say, let's go for a walk. Let's do walk and talk. And they're like, what's a walk and talk? I'm like, 2 rules to the walk and talk. You dress comfortably and you don't want anything from anybody. And politics and religion is okay. Because if we can't talk to each other like 2 human beings, then like, why are we even going to talk to each other? Like we can disagree on stuff. Like, if that's not cool with you, then like, I don't want to talk to you anyway. Like we have to be able to talk to each other. So I went with it. So that I started doing that with 0 expectations. Just kind of like randomly, the 4th guy that I ended up doing a walk and talk with happened to own a $100 million hotel chain. And then in that conversation, inevitably business and business and entrepreneurship conversations come up. And so then we started talking, and then he said, hey, how can I get you to help me with that? And I said, I don't know. I'm the wandering Kung Fu master. You tell me how you can get me to help me with that. Right. Like, I don't know, like that's how it works. That's how I'm doing this. So he made me an offer of something that he's like, hey, can you help me with this to get me from point A to point B? And I'm like, yep, I can do that. And he paid me very well, and probably took me a couple hours a week worth of time. And so I did, my hourly rate was really high. And then that same system has kind of unfolded in numerous ways over the last 2 years, especially with COVID. There were a lot of opportunities that kind of came my way for me to help people. And I helped lots of people who I never made a dollar from. It was really just me wanting to help entrepreneurs and help them get through where they're at. While other ones, there were financial opportunities there for me that I've made, both in terms of advising fees as well as investment opportunities. Every advising fee I've gotten paid so far, I've reinvested in more in some other company that I met through this process. So my advising fees are really just a way of kind of okay, cool. You're committed to working together. Great. And then I end up usually just taking those and investing them in somebody else's, or maybe even that person. You never know. Because a lot of the people I'm investing in, almost all in the short term for sure, are all people who've come out of this process. People that I've met that I'm helping move along. Because when you think about it as an investor, wouldn't I just prefer to work with the people that I already know and I've already know all the ins and outs of? Unlike when I was buying companies and I had to do all that diligence and I had to figure it out, and making reference to that article that you guys were reading, you're always surprised. You don't there's always a surprise. So far in this case, I invest in something, I know all the surprises because I've been talking to these guys for, every week for the last year, or 18 months, whatever it's been. That's a really good way to invest in a business, because you kind of know what's up. So anyway, that's been my approach more recently, has been that more wandering Kung Fu master investor strategy, which now I've become more associated. I've connected with a bunch of VC groups, which I'm making introductions to the people that I work with, the companies that I work with. So there's a lot of cross kind of connections and resource sharing that I can kind of bring together, because I have this wide view. So I'm always thinking efficiency and connections, kind of the same as I used to do on a company level, because I will talk about those things at a company level. But then I've kind of been able to get a broader view across all my companies, as I like to refer to them, to figure out how there's connections that can be made, or how I can bring in financing for these guys, or connect these guys to a bank that I know that might be able to help them with what they're trying to accomplish, or whatever.
Yeah, so, I love that. I mean, I think there are a couple of things to unpack there. And then I actually do want to circle back and talk a little blockchain for a minute if we've got time. But what I love a lot about what you were just talking about, I mean, actually I can sort of empathize, or I can relate to what you're talking about, and how, sales isn't your jam, but really relationship development is, because that's sort of the stuff that I love doing as well. And I think what I like about it so much, and this is clear as day on your sort of, I guess would be considered a consultative website or a personal website. You basically just spell everything out in black and white. You're wildly transparent. You just share all the data, include, all the way down to, what your last fee received was, just so that people have a gauge before they even get to you. And I think that little bit of transparency, I mean, even in the spirit of relationship development, being so open and being so transparent, immediately sort of reveals the kind of character you are and the kind of person that you're, should one choose to engage with you, they kind of know what they're getting before they get in. And I think that that's really great. I also just wanted to say, I think for a lot of people, and I think this is scary, especially if you're the breadwinner and you've got to put, food on the plate. So maybe it's got to be a part-time hustle or something. But, when you can work in a position where you're not dying for the next check, you're not trying to get something, or you're not trying to squeeze something out of somebody, and you can just have a conversation, and maybe it goes somewhere, maybe it doesn't. But I think being allowed to have those types of conversations that are basically not, have no strings attached, I think do so much in terms of business development, and relationship development, in terms of building trust and all that sort of stuff that then ultimately manifests itself. So it's funny how just sort of putting out into the universe that, I'm not being greedy. I'm not just trying to take your money. I'm not trying to do this and that I actually mean you well, sort of manifests itself into a pretty healthy living.
For sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. You know what else I'd recommend? Something that you kind of pointed out there. I'd recommend to people when they're trying to make the leap from maybe I got to put the food on the table. I'm trying to get my job to become an entrepreneur, or I already have a small business that's just not doing what I need it to do and I need to make it better. My major recommendation on that is to shift your mindset from like, I need to make sales, I need to make money, to how do I drive value for someone? Like, always revert it back to that question in your mind, because if you can say, how do I drive value for someone? What do they want and what do they need? And how do I get that to them? You never have to do sales again, basically, is what it comes down to. Because if it's abundantly clear, there was something I learned in an economics class way back when, that basically said nobody pays more than what something's worth. So if something's worth $100, they're always going to pay less than $100, right? Because if it's not worth more, if it's worth $100 to me, I'm not going to pay more than $100. So you have to figure out how to deliver that $100 for less than $100, so you can make your profit. And they'll happily give you the money when you've got the value clearly. If they're like, hey, that's worth $100, I'm going to pay $95 for it, but it cost you $80 to make it. Perfect. That's it's a no-brainer. Like, think of it in terms of financial products. If I was going to buy a bond that has a face value of $1,000, okay, let's take cost of time value of money and all the inflation and all that out of the equation. But the point is, if I'm going to buy something that has a face value of $1,000 for $950, I will give you all my money. Like, I'll give you if I could do that consistently, I will give you all my money. So that's how you have to think of your business in general, is if you can drive so much value and you're because that person sees it that way, that it's $100 and you're going to sell it to me for $95. Perfect. I'll do that all day long.
Well, yeah, I think you make a great point about just value, and understanding. You mentioned it sort of in conversation or sort of flippantly, but that's worth $100 to me, right?
Exactly.
So it's not just even about what you think. It's about, what does your consumer think, or what does the person who's engaging with your product or service, what do they think your product is worth? So to sort of just reinforce your point, the idea that you need to be delivering on the value, exactly, is what's going to drive up that perceived value by whoever the end user is. So yeah. I think that's a great point.
And listen to your customers, because 95+% of entrepreneurs that I know and that I've seen, they build a business around what they think is a good idea. And then they try to convince everyone that it's a good idea. It's much easier to listen to what your customer thinks is a good idea first, and then build that.
Well, and I actually really like the walk and talk conversations that you do, because those kind of conversations, you're able to get those, pull that out of your customer in an informal way and just have that conversation while talking. And you can actually kind of define what they need and what is of value to them. You're not sitting around a table in an office trying to hash that out. You're just having a walk and you're having a legit conversation with them, which you'll get more clarity out of the equation versus just sitting there and coming into a business meeting, which I love that.
Absolutely. So. And to keep it honest, you have to approach it knowing that you're going to give fully to this person while you're doing that. Like, you give the information, you provide as much engagement in that conversation as possible with zero expectations of getting anything out of it, because then it's honest. And then you're showing and proving that you're providing value now. And then like I said, then it just turns into like, oh, hey, look, we have a connection here. There's something I can do for you long-term that's helpful, or maybe there isn't. Maybe I could just help you along the way and you move along, and good for you. I'm glad I was able to help. Like, that's the approach. Honestly, if the whole world worked like that, like, everyone would be better off. So.
Agreed.
Yeah. Our philosophy around that's very similar actually to your walk and talk, is just this concept that you have to break bread to make bread, right? If you want to make money, you got to break bread. You got to sit down and have these conversations. And again, the whole point is in-person interaction, just being able to have these free flowing conversations that aren't based on, or, predicated on any return. And I think it's just absolutely critical for relationship building.
For sure. Cool.
Well, so, Brian, did you have a question on blockchain before we take off? I think you.
Yeah, I wanted to circle back to it, and Yeah. So in 81C, as you were talking about, the idea was that you could have sort of this, and I'll probably butcher this a little bit, so feel free to fix me. But the idea was basically that you were capable of registering, anybody worldwide could invest in an organization. And basically you were using blockchain technology as a way of sort of proving your purchase or proving your investment. Correct. And so I wonder if you talk a little bit about just how that worked. And one of the reasons is a little bit selfish for me, but I've been trying to figure out how to build some level of blockchain technology into my business. For example, I run a marketing and design company, and I have a lot of thoughts around blockchain as sort of almost like a replacement for the trademark office or the copyright office. Sure. And so I'm really interested in it. I sell NFTs and I sell all kinds of stuff. So I have some experience in it. But for people who don't really understand the blockchain, don't know what it is, or it's an emerging technology and people don't have their heads wrapped around it. Do you mind talking about just, first of all, what it is? Second of all, how you were able to apply it in your organization, and what you think sort of the future of that technology is.
Yeah, good question. So just as a high level overview, which I'm sure you both are aware, but if there's listeners that aren't, high level overview is basically blockchain is like a distributed immutable database. So basically that it's a single one version of the truth. I can call back that phrase. It's a single version of the truth, like a grandmaster database that no one can change without everyone knowing that it was changed. So therefore, when I put something into the database that says, Ryan owns this piece of real estate, for example, he owns that piece of real estate because we all agreed to it when we put it in there, and it can't be changed by anybody. So that's what allows you to have kind of basically a unique, because the problem on the internet is the duplicate payment problem, or like currencies, right? Duplicate payments. Like if I had a digital token without blockchain, I could just copy that token and give it to somebody else, and then the token has no value. Where because you can say this particular string of numbers represents this token, and we all agree that's the token, and this is the guy who's holding on to it at this moment, that's what allows it to work. So that's kind of like blockchain in general. And obviously for our use case, it was very clear. It was a stock certificate, basically, right? Like back in the old days, they literally would send you a piece of paper with a number on it that was officially, issued by the company that represented a share of the company. And so really the technology conceptually works exactly the same way. And that's exactly what we used it for with the token offering and the tokenized equity.
That's amazing.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think that there's obviously a lot of applications for it. So I just love hearing how people are using this technology in their own businesses, because, there's one version of it that people see in the news or whatever, that's Bitcoin and that kind of thing. But there are just so many applications for this. And it is funny, that it does relate back to, it's almost the future of your, single source database. This is the next iteration of that. So
that's right. Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity in blockchain. I think because of its scale, like I said earlier about the shipping thing, because of its potential scale, the entry point in which it becomes useful is probably going to be exponential. It's going to be one of those things where right now it's kind of, there's these like fringe applications. And when we say fringe, we talk about a multi-trillion-dollar cryptocurrency world, right? So, but that's fringe at this point still. So, there's these fringe uses. There's the NFT market, which is just like going crazy. So like these different use cases, but I think just like the internet, it'll kind of sort of plot along of like, here's this case, here's that case, here's this case. And then before you know it, it's integrated through all sorts of things. And it's just like part of our existence. And I don't think we're going to be able to, I won't be able to predict like what industry or what market is the tipping point for that, like really that revolution to kind of happen. And it might happen because of the way blockchain works. It might happen in pieces. Like it might take over a whole industry, which I guess is kind of how the internet went too. To kind of take over industry by industry, as time goes by, as people figure out how to integrate it and be able to make that change within that industry in a way that is reasonable, because you can't get everyone to do it all at once. Like it has to be modular. It has to be a modular change in order for it to work.
No, I think it'll be really exciting and interesting to see what's going on in the future. So here in these closing couple minutes, do you just want to share with our audience where people can engage with you, where they can find you online, or if they're interested in your consulting work or anything else?
Yeah. So first, let me just say that I am as open to talk to people as I appear to be. Like I talk to people about all sorts of things. So reach out to me. It's like however you want to get a hold of me. If you look me up on LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn. I don't check that much, but I am on there if you want to read about me. And my website's thebigda.com. That was the one you noted earlier, thebigda.com. And I think there's an email address on there. So if you get a hold of me, I think you'll be able to find me. So give it a whirl. And I'm happy to talk with anyone about any subject, whether it's business or philosophy or any of the above. So
I love that. Well, thank you, Dan. I really appreciate your time. It's been a great conversation, and I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
That's been awesome. And thanks so much to everybody who tunes into the show this week and every week, and we'll see you all next time.